We just want to be left in peace. There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said that if we lose that war, and in doing so lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent it from happening. Well, I think it's time we asked ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. This next section is a section particularly dear to my heart. It was given before I was born. Not too long ago, two friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told the entire story. As I turn and see the junior senator from Florida, I know he and I both know, as I hope does every member of this body, just how precious and fragile the freedom is that we enjoy in this country. As President Reagan continued in that speech, if we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan for our lives better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are increasingly told that we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd not like to suggest there's no such thing as left or right. There's only up or down. Up, man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order. Or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. Given the topic of this discussion, the asserted power of the President to take the life out of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil without due process of law, that last portion bears reading again. Those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past and among themselves. And of all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say, quote, "The Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism." Another voice says, "The profit motive has become outdated. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state." Or, quote, "Our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the President as, quote, "our moral teacher and our leader." And he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. Let me read that one again, too, because that also is very applicable to the discussion this evening. He referred to the President as, quote, "our moral leader and our moral teacher and our leader." And he says he is, quote, "hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document, the Constitution. He must, quote, be freed so he can do what he knows is best. And Senator Clark from Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as, quote, the masses. That is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the, quote, full power of our centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know that when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also know, these Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy. Now, we have no better example of this than government's involvement in the farm economy over the last 30 years. Since 1955, the cost of this program has nearly doubled. 1/4 of farming in America is responsible for 85% of the farm surplus. 3/4 of farming is out of the free market and has known a 21% increase in the per capita consumption of all its produce. And I'm going to skip further along. To the end of this speech, which I will confess, not unlike the speeches given on this floor, was not a short speech. I will move to the end where President Reagan continued and said, "Those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation, and they say we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy. He'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. We cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat by committing an immorality as so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom because to save your skins, we're making a deal with your slave masters." Alexander Hamilton said, "A nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master, and deserved one." Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war. But there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter that we face. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. And this is the meaning in the phrase of Barry Goldwater's Peace Through Strength. Winston Churchill said, "The destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals." And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith in you and I to have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. That path, the path of standing and fighting for freedom, even when it seems daunting, even when it seems the gestalt of the moment is on the other side, is a path with many honorable forebears. And I can tell you, speaking and echoing the sentiment of the millions on Twitter, of the people following this stand for principle tonight, that if the 100 senators of this body stand together and say, regardless of party, liberty will always prevail, regardless of party, the Constitution is the governing body, the governing document in this nation, then we will be doing our jobs. And I commend you, Senator Paul, for a lonely stand that, as the night has worn on, has not proven quite so lonely. And indeed, were you the only senator standing at his desk this evening, it would not be lonely in that circumstance either, because you would be standing shoulder to shoulder with millions of Americans that do not wish the federal government to assert arbitrary power over our lives, over our liberty, over our property, but who instead want a government that remains a limited government of enumerated powers that protects the God-given rights each of us is blessed to have. And the question I ask of you, what, in your judgment, is America without liberty? Who are we if we are not a free people?
Mr. President, I want to thank the gentleman from Texas for his remarks, and I think he's hit it exactly on the head, and the question is a very pertinent question. The question is really, where do we go from here? I see this as a struggle. I see that we're engaged in an epic struggle, but it's not a struggle between Republicans and Democrats. It's a struggle between the President and the Constitution. The question is, does the President have the power and the prerogative to have his way regardless of the Constitution? The question is, does the Attorney General get to say that he will adhere to the Fifth Amendment when he chooses to? Is there a choice for American citizens on American soil that they either get the Fifth Amendment protections or they don't get the Fifth Amendment protections? So this really is a struggle, not only between the President and the Constitution, but between the Senate and the Congress and the President to say whether or not the President gets to determine this policy or whether this is a policy that should come from Congress. I think we should be asking not just for the President to give his memos on drones, we should be giving him our memos on drones. We need to be dictating the law to the President and not acquiescing and giving the President this authority. This should be a battle between the executive and the legislative. It should involve Republicans and Democrats trying to restrain the President from saying that he has the ability to decide when you get Fifth Amendment protections and when you don't. At this time, I would, without yielding the floor, like to entertain a question from the senator from Florida.
Mr. President. Thank you. First of all, let me congratulate the junior senator from Texas on a fantastic question. In that question, he used Shakespeare references. He used a reference to the movie Patton, one of the great movies. I didn't bring my Shakespeare book, so let me just begin by quoting a modern-day poet. His name is Wiz Khalifa. He has a song called "Work Hard, Play Hard." It's the name of how it started. I think as you look at the time, I think it's a time when many of our colleagues expected to be home, back in the home state, playing hard, but I'm happy that we're here still working hard on this issue. It's actually really stunning. If you watch from home, if you hear the audience of people watching on the news or whatever, what's going on here, because I think it's important to explain what exactly is happening here. What's happening here is pretty straightforward. The senator from Kentucky has asked a question of the administration. It's a pretty straightforward question. Is it constitutional for the federal government to kill a non-combatant U.S. citizen in the United States. Now, we all have strong feelings about that program. We all have strong feelings about the war on terror. These are all legitimate issues. But this is a very direct question that's been asked. And what would have resolved this hours ago, from my understanding, and if I'm incorrect, the senator from Kentucky will correct me in a moment, my understanding is he has offered two ways to bring this to a resolution. One is just a statement from the White House, a clear, unequivocal statement that says, of course it's unconstitutional, that's not going to happen, unconstitutional, just a straightforward statement of that magnitude. In fact, I've been watching on television over the last few hours. I saw the senator from Kentucky say they've reached out to the White House. They've been unable to get any sort of direct response. Maybe that's changed in the interim. I don't know. We'll hear from him in a moment. The other is, and I heard he made a motion to have a resolution heard here that made it clear that that was the sense of this body. That the sense of this body would be that this is unconstitutional. Again, pretty straightforward. I'm not sure even those among us who are, let's just say those among us who believe that this program is necessary and important and so forth and so on, I don't know anybody in this body who believes that a non-combatant U.S. citizen in the United States, not doing anything of imminent danger, should somehow be killed by the U.S. government. Nor do people home believe that either. So there was a sense of the Senate that this is the case, and in exchange for that vote, of course, the vote on Mr. Brennan would move forward, and that's been rejected. This doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I actually go to a movie, one of the great American movies, The Godfather. There's a quote in that movie. I don't have the patent quotes, but I have the Godfather quotes. This is one of the best-known ones. He says, I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. To me, these are offers you can't refuse. Straightforward offers you can't refuse, and yet they've been refused. And I think that's pretty stunning. The third thing I want to say is, I want you to imagine what this conversation would be like tonight if the president was George W. Bush, and if this issue was about George W. Bush. Just imagine that for a moment now. If he had been asked this direct question and had refused to answer, what this chamber would look like tonight, what the arguments being made would be like tonight. Just imagine that for a moment. That takes me back to another modern-day poet by the name of Jay-Z. In one of his songs he wrote, "It's funny what 7 days can change. It was all good just a week ago." Well, I don't know if it was all good a week ago, but I can tell you that things have really changed. Because if the president was George W. Bush and this was a question being asked of him and his response was the silence we've gotten, we'd have a very different scenario here tonight, except that I actually believe the senator from Kentucky would be on the floor making the exact same arguments he's making. I want everybody that's watching to clearly understand, and if I'm wrong, the senator from Kentucky is going to correct me here in a moment. What he's asking is just a simple, straightforward response. Or, if we can't get that, a simple and straightforward response from the members of this body in a sense of the Senate resolution. Both have been rejected. Now, the last observation that I would have tonight is that there have been some pretty phenomenal legal analysis done here on the floor. That reminds me of the most famous quote from The Godfather that was never actually used in the movie. I don't know how that happened. Maybe they cut it out. Here's the quote. "A lawyer with his briefcase can steal more than 100 men with guns." Can steal. I don't know how that's relevant to this, but I thought it was a really good quote, and I thought I'd bring it up because I went to law school. I'm a lawyer. I was a land use and zoning attorney, which meant if I wound up in the courtroom, something went horribly wrong with a land use and zoning application. But the point is, we've had some very good legal arguments here tonight on the constitutional issues with regards to this. And I think those are important to discuss, and I'm glad that much time has been spent on those. And it's important for the people at home to fully understand what the legal arguments are here, because they are important. They go to the heart of our Constitution. They go to the heart of our civil liberties. They go to the heart of the things that distinguish our nation. But I think what's really stunning to me, clearly the constitutional issue is important, is how simple and straightforward how this issue is and how easily it could have been resolved. And I don't know how many hours we're into this now, but it looks like, I think it's about 11 hours and 15 minutes.
About 11 and a half right now.
Because we can't get a straightforward answer. And the members of this body deserve that. The members of this body deserve an answer. Doesn't matter what party you're in, doesn't matter what party the president's in. This is a legitimate question that's being asked. And all this could be over if we could just get a straightforward answer. And I think that's something every member of this body should care about. It's not a Republican question, not a conservative question. It's a constitutional question, a relevant question, one that should be easy to answer. And the idea that they're refusing to answer it for some reason, I don't know if it's pride or because they think it's beneath them or they've got something else going on or maybe it snowed too much today and the answer department was shut down. Either way, I just don't understand how they can't answer this very straightforward question. It reminds me of another line from The Godfather when Michael turns to Fredo and says, Fredo, you're my older brother and I love you, but don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again. Well, that is kind of what's happening here. As an institution, as the Senate, we deserve to have rights to these answers. It doesn't matter who the president is. We have a job to do that we're held responsible for, that we're held accountable for. 30 years from now, 40 years from now, 20 years from now, 10 years from now, these sorts of decisions will have ramifications. Long after any of us here are gone, all of us here are gone, there'll be other people in these chairs. And maybe it's our children or our grandchildren or our great-grandchildren will visit this building and they will read about the time that we served here. And if we are making mistakes, history will record those mistakes and hold us accountable for those mistakes. If things are happening today that set the groundwork for things in the future, because that's the other thing we need to remember. No matter how you feel about the current president, he's not going to be president forever. But the precedents he sets could very well guide what future presidents do. And so the point is that if we are laying the groundwork here today, making mistakes by not asking certain questions, history will hold us accountable for that. And that's all of us, not one of us, not five of us, not the Republican part of the Senate, all of us. We have a right to ask these questions and to get these questions answered. That's not being obstructionist. That's not being partisan. That's being a senator. And I'll tell you, I've only been here 2 years, but I know enough of this process already to know that every single one of us, at some point, when the majority changes, when the new president's elected, at some point, every single one of us is going to want to know an answer to a question from the administration or some other branch or element of government, and they're going to hold us off. They're going to give us the Heisman. They're going to stiff-arm us. And they're going to try to push us aside and not answer the question. And I would sure hope that at that moment, whether you agree with that person or not, that you would stand and defend their prerogative and their right as a representative of their state to get legitimate questions answered in a straightforward way. And so, as I said earlier today when I came to the floor, this issue is about this institution as much as anything else, about the right of every single member of this body to be able to ask legitimate questions of the administration or other branches of government and get a straightforward answer. And so I guess the question that I would have for the senator from Kentucky, the junior senator from Kentucky, that I'll ask here in just a moment, the question that I would have for the junior senator from Kentucky is, just to clarify, my understanding is that this issue could have been brought to a resolution quite a long time ago if the White House had either A, made their feelings well known in a statement, you can just put that out there in 30 seconds and it will be done, just come out and say it, that it is unconstitutional to kill U.S. citizens that are non-combatants who are in the United States. That's one route. And the other thing that could have ended this is the unanimous consent motion that he made to have this body vote on a sense of the Senate, and that would have brought it to a vote. Is that accurate? Are those the options before us?
Mr. President, that's exactly the sequence of things. We've been in contact with the White House throughout the night. We've made several phone calls to the White House. We've told them we're willing to allow a vote on the Brennan nomination. All we ask in return is that we get a clarification of whether or not they believe they have the authority under the Constitution to target Americans on American soil. And I think it's a question that's fair to ask. And we've been willing to let them have the vote at any time, earlier tonight, obviously, as well as in the morning. All we've asked in return from the White House is a clarification. The last report I got from the White House is they were done talking tonight. I hope that doesn't mean they're done talking tomorrow. I really think this struggle is an important struggle, and I think that there really needs to be clarification from the White House before this goes forward, because this is a point in time when the question has been raised, and it's important for them, I think, to answer the question that the Fifth Amendment is not optional. You don't get to choose to adhere to the Fifth Amendment. It applies to U.S. citizens on U.S. soil, and there are no exceptions to that. With that, I would, without yielding the floor, I'd like to entertain a question from the senator from South Dakota, if he has one.
Well, I thank the senator from Kentucky for yielding for a question, and I appreciate his diligence in continuing in this late hour and trying to get answers to some very important questions. I think many of us, when we got up and came in here this morning, were preparing and getting ready for the big blizzard of 2013, which of course never materialized here in Washington, D.C., but evidently there are a lot of agencies of government that weren't here today, and perhaps when they get back, the senator from Kentucky will get an answer to his question. But I think it's a really straightforward question. And I'm someone this evening who has supported the use of drones in fighting the war on terror. I think they've been very effective in killing terrorists, people who want to do harm to the people of this country. But I think that the question that's been raised by the senator from Kentucky and the reason why we are here this evening has to do with a straightforward issue. And he's got a sense of the Senate that he's prepared to have the Senate go on record on. And it's very simple and very straightforward. It says, resolved that it is the sense of the Senate that, number one, the use of drones to execute or to target American citizens on American soil who pose no imminent threat clearly violates the constitutional due process rights of citizens. Number two, the American people deserve a clear, concise, and unequivocal public statement from the President of the United States that contains detailed legal reasoning, including, but not limited to, the balance between national security and due process, limits of executive power, and distinction between treatment of citizens and non-citizens within and outside the borders of the United States, the use of lethal force against American citizens, and the use of drones and the application of lethal force within United States territory. It is a very straightforward resolution, a sense of the Senate, and all that the senator from Kentucky is simply doing is trying to get a response, get a vote on that, make that the statement here of the United States Senate, and obviously get the President of the United States, the White House, and Mr. Brennan, whose nomination is pending before us, to make a clarification on that point. And it's not like this issue popped up overnight. The senator from Kentucky has been trying for some time to get answers to this question. He's submitted numerous letters and addressed to Mr. Brennan. A letter here, this is one I'm quoting from February 12th, in which he poses numerous questions, one of which is, do you believe that the President has the power to authorize lethal force, such as a drone strike, against a United States citizen on U.S. soil? What about the use of lethal force against a non-U.S. person on U.S. soil? I mean, these are straightforward questions, Madam President, to which the senator from Kentucky deserves an answer. And this is a perfectly fitting and appropriate time in which to try and get that answer. The nomination of the CIA director, it's an incredibly important and strategic position in this country. And, of course, under the Constitution of the United States, Article 2, Section 2, this is the President has the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. And he shall nominate, and by and with the advice of the Senate shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, judges of the Supreme Court, and other officers of the United States. So it's the advise and consent power that the United States Senate has under the Constitution that the senator from Kentucky is exercising on this nomination. And Madam President, again, it's been pointed out many times on the floor of the Senate today, this is not something that is a partisan issue. It is not a Democrat or Republican issue. This is something that has ramifications. It's a constitutional question. It has to do with due process under law. It has to do with the advise and consent power in the Constitution of the United States Senate. And so when the senator from Kentucky continues to press the administration for a straightforward answer, he continues to get sort of these vague, ambiguous answers, if you will. And again, these are questions that have, it's not like this popped up overnight. Back in January 25th of this year, in 2013, the senator from Kentucky posed of Mr. Brennan a series of questions at that time. And the follow-on letter, which I quoted from earlier here, was on February the 12th. But he put forward questions such as, do you agree with the argument put forth on numerous occasions by the executive branch that it is legal to order the killing of American citizens, and it is not compelled to explain its reasoning in reaching this conclusion? Do you believe this is a good precedent for the government to set? He goes on to ask another question. Would it not be appropriate to require a judge or court to review every case before the individual in question is added to a targeting list. Please describe the due process requirements in place for those individuals being considered for addition to a targeting list. Would you agree that it is paradoxical that the federal government would need to go before a judge to authorize a wiretap on a U.S. citizen overseas, but possibly not to order a lethal drone strike against the same individual? If not, please explain why you believe something similar to the FISA standard should not be applied in regards to lethal actions against United States citizens. Madam President, these are straightforward questions. These are questions to which I believe the senator from Kentucky deserves an answer. And many of us are here this evening at this late hour to support him in that endeavor and his attempt at least to try and, as this nomination moves through the process, get the answers to the questions that would allow him to perform the advise and consent function that is in the United States Constitution as it applies to nominations and as it is has been implemented here by United States senators in history. And I just want to say to the senator from Kentucky, and I have a question for him in just a moment, that it really is remarkable to see this process unfold. In my time here, and I came in the 2004 election, started my service in the United States Senate in January of 2005, I've not seen a time where we had a senator who, as a matter of principle, stood down here for the number of hours that he has today and insisted on getting some answers. And I give him great credit for the job that he has done in pressing this issue. Now, he's not been given that answer yet. It sounds like kind of come up to the line a couple of times. It's very simple. You could put this thing to rest. All they have to do is come forward and answer that very simple question about the legal authority to target American citizens on American soil with drone attacks. It doesn't seem to me, at least, that that would be that hard of a question to answer. They say as a matter of policy they've not done that. They don't have any intention of doing it in the future. Why don't we just put this issue to rest once and for all? And the senator from Kentucky will allow the process to go forward, and Mr. Brennan can get his vote. But I think in the time at least that I've been here, it certainly is remarkable to me to see the amount of effort that the senator from Kentucky has put forward in trying to answer a very straightforward question. And for that I give him great credit, because it's a principled stand, something that too often we don't see enough of around here. And to stand down here and use his powers as a United States Senator in a way that's very fitting with the tradition and history of this great institution. You look at the United States Senate and those who have come before, and the great characters of our history, Clay and Calhoun and others who have graced the United States Senate, and some of the great debates that have occurred in the past. And it's nice to see us discussing and debating a major constitutional issue, a major constitutional question. And I, like many of my colleagues who are here this evening, support the senator from Kentucky in his quest to get answers. I think it's certainly appropriate. I think it certainly should be expected that the administration respond to what are very straightforward questions with regard to the issue that's been raised by the senator. And I would hope that that question or that answer will be forthcoming. If it's not, it's entirely possible, I suppose, that this could continue for some time into the future. But in any event, I would ask the senator from Kentucky if what it would take in terms of some sort of affirmation, some sort of answer, some sort of response from the White House, from the nominee, the director of the CIA, to satisfy the question that he has raised. It seems to me, at least as a senator from South Dakota, that the question that you posed is a straightforward and simple one, and merely requires a very simple answer.
Madam President, I thank the senator from South Dakota for his remarks, and would make the comment that I, like he, have seen things that the drones can do to protect our soldiers, and no one's arguing against that. No one's really arguing against drones or any other kind of use of force to defend the country against any kind of attack. But what we are arguing for is that non-combatants, people not engaged in combat in our country, are due Fifth Amendment protections, and that the White House should acknowledge this. This is important because the drone strikes overseas, when looking at the category and looking at the way they're being done and under what standards, there are some of those standards that we don't think are appropriate for U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. So we're asking for a clarification. We think Attorney General Holder got close to that today under the duress of cross-examination. We'd like to see him do it voluntarily in a nice, concise statement. We'd be happy to vote on the Brennan nomination as early as tomorrow morning. I would like to yield the time to the minority leader.
Yeah, I thank my colleague from Kentucky, and first let me say I think our mutual constituents have certainly learned.
President, was there a unanimous consent request?
Would the senator from Kentucky yield for question?
Yes.
First, let me say I thank my friend from Kentucky. First, let me thank him for his courage and conviction. Having been here a while in the Senate, we've only rarely, as Senator Thune pointed out, had extended debate on any matter. A body that came into existence for the purpose of lengthy discussions of weighty issues has in recent years had very little lengthy discussion of weighty issues. And if I understand the issue the senator from Kentucky feels so passionately about, is that the administration should answer a question that is pretty easily stated, as I understand it, as follows. Does the administration take the view that a drone strike against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil would be an appropriate use of that weapon? Am I correct that that's the question that the senator from Kentucky hopes to get an answer to from the administration?
Yes.
And I assume the senator from Kentucky shares my view that it's a pretty easily understood question. It strikes me that that's a question pretty easily understood, and it has to be something the administration's given some thought to, given the development of this new weapon. I heard Senator Barrasso earlier today just talking about how this technology has really changed. I mean, would never have thought of this a few years ago. This technology has actually changed warfare in a very dramatic way. And so as I understand it, what the senator from Kentucky is looking for is a question of how this dramatic new weapon applies to the U.S. Constitution. The use of it applies to the U.S. Constitution on American soil. And so I think it's entirely appropriate that the senator from Kentucky engage in an extended debate with the support of his colleagues to get the answer to this question. And I wanted to congratulate him for his tenacity, for his conviction, and for being able to rally the support of a great many people. There are also people who come over from the House of Representatives who feel also, I gather, that this is a legitimate question that the administration ought to be answered. And I might say at whatever point we get to a cloture vote to extend debate on the nomination of Brennan, it is my view that cloture should not be invoked. This is a controversial nominee. Should cloture be invoked, I intend to oppose the nomination and congratulate my colleague from Kentucky for this extraordinary effort.
Thank you. Madam President, I want to thank the minority leader for his remarks and for his insightful questions. The question about whether or not the president has actually gotten involved with what would the rules be has actually been somewhat broached. He was asked at Google about whether this could occur, and he said, well, the rules would have to be different outside than inside. So it implies that they have thought about what the rules should be inside, but to my knowledge, no one in the Intelligence Committee has been informed what the rules are inside. It troubles me that they think they have the authority to do targeted drone strikes inside, particularly when there are examples where the Twin Towers and 1941 Pearl Harbor. Those would be attacks that you would repulse no matter who you knew was coming in. They wouldn't be a targeted strike on an individual as a designated time. You would repulse those attacks militarily, and they really wouldn't even fall into the category of what we're talking about here as targeted drone strikes. You might use drones, but they wouldn't really be what we're talking about, nor is the question we've been asking all day. So they've answered a question, just not the question we asked.
I thank my friend from Kentucky.
Madam President, I'd like to yield for a question from the senator from Pennsylvania.
Madam President, I would like to spend a couple of moments here revisiting the context in which this discussion occurred. I want to commend the senator from Kentucky for raising what I think is an extremely important issue and forcing the attention of this body to this issue at an appropriate time, which he has done, and I might add, at great personal inconvenience to himself. This really arose from a letter that the senator from Kentucky sent to Mr. Brennan, the nominee for Director of Central Intelligence, and the response that he got. And these are short letters. I want to review this so that it's very clear exactly what was posed and what the response was and where we are at the moment in this debate. The letter from the senator from Kentucky begins, "Dear Mr. Brennan, in consideration of your nomination to be the Director of Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, I have repeatedly requested that you provide answers to several questions clarifying your role in the approval of lethal force against terrorism suspects, particularly those who are U.S. citizens. Your past actions in this regard, as well as your view of the limitations to which you are subject, are of critical importance in assessing your qualifications to lead the CIA. If it is not clear that you will honor the limits placed upon the executive branch by the Constitution, then the Senate should not confirm you to lead the CIA." And clearly this is the idea that is under scrutiny this evening. The letter goes on to say, "During your confirmation process in the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, committee members have quite appropriately made requests similar to questions I have raised in my previous letter to you, that you expound on your views on the limits of executive power in using lethal force against U.S. citizens, especially when operating on U.S. soil. In fact, the chairman of the SSCI, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, Senator Feinstein, specifically asked you in post-hearing questions, for the record, whether the administration could carry out drone strikes inside the United States. In your response, you emphasized that the administration, quote, has not carried out, end quote, such strikes, and, quote, has no intention of doing so, end quote. I do not find this response sufficient. Now let me just add editorially, I don't know how anyone could find that sufficient. It clearly is an evasion of the question. That doesn't answer the question that was posed by Senator Feinstein, just as we haven't been able to get an answer to the question posed by the senator from Kentucky. The letter goes on to say, the question that I and many others have asked is not whether the administration has or intends to carry out drone strikes inside the United States, but whether it believes it has the authority to do so. This is an important distinction that should not be ignored. And this, of course, goes to the heart of the question. Does this administration believe that it has the authority to carry out a lethal strike by a drone against an American citizen on American soil? The letter goes on to say, just last week, President Obama also avoided this question when posed to him directly. Instead of addressing the question of whether the administration could kill a U.S. citizen on American soil, used a similar line that, quote, there has never been a drone used on an American citizen on American soil, end quote. The evasive replies from the administration to this valid question have only confused the issue further without getting us any closer to an actual answer. I'd say again, this is my editorial comment, I think that's a generous assessment. When a direct question is asked and the party to whom the question is directed repetitively evades the question, it makes you seriously wonder what their intentions are. The letter goes on to say, for that reason, I once again request you answer the following question. Do you believe that the President has the power to authorize lethal force, such as a drone strike, against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil and without a trial? I believe the only acceptable answer to this is no. Until you directly and clearly answer, I plan to use every procedural option at my disposal to delay your confirmation and bring added scrutiny to this issue and the administration's policies on the use of lethal force. The American people are rightly concerned, and they deserve a frank and open discussion on these policies. Sincerely, Rand Paul, MD, United States Senator. And I have to say, this is a very straightforward and simple question. It's been posed clearly. It's been posed repeatedly. And now I want to share with you, Madam President, the answer, such as it is, that we've received. The most recent answer that was directed to the senator from Kentucky, which again I would suggest is not responsive to the question. A letter dated March 4th, addressed to Senator Paul, says, on February 20th, 2013, you, referring to Senator Paul, wrote to John Brennan requesting additional information concerning the administration's view about whether, quote, the president has the power to authorize lethal force, such as a drone strike, against a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil and without trial, end quote. The letter goes on to say, as members of this administration have previously indicated, the U.S. government has not carried out drone strikes in the United States and has no intention of doing so. As a policy matter, moreover, we reject the use of military force where well-established law enforcement authorities in this country provide the best means for incapacitating a terrorist threat. We have a long history of using the criminal justice system to incapacitate individuals located in our country who pose a threat to the United States and its interests abroad. Hundreds of individuals have been arrested and convicted of terrorism-related offenses in our federal court. The question you have posed is therefore entirely hypothetical, unlikely to occur, and one we hope no president will ever have to confront. It is possible, I suppose, to imagine an extraordinary circumstance in which it would be necessary and appropriate under the Constitution and applicable laws of the United States for the president to authorize the military use of lethal force within the territory of the United States. For example, the president could conceivably have no choice but to authorize the military use of such force if necessary to protect the homeland in the circumstances of a catastrophic attack like the one suffered on December 7th, 1941 and September 11, 2001. Were such an emergency to arise, I would examine the particular facts and circumstances before advising the president on the scope of his authority. Sincerely, Eric H. Holder, Jr., Attorney General. The reason I read the entire letter is because I didn't want anyone to think that any part of this was being taken out of context or anything was being left out. I think when you read the entire letter, in response to the entire letter that was sent as a request, I think it's very clear. This administration refuses to answer a simple and very important and very legitimate question. Our Attorney General suggests that under certain set of circumstances, which he won't specify any guiding principles or rules that would allow us to understand those circumstances, he would examine the facts and circumstances and then advise the president on the scope of his authority. There's no suggestion of what legal authority he has to do this. There's no description of the constitutional authority. I find this very, very disturbing. You know, we've all observed the very new developments that we're experiencing in national security. The Minority Leader alluded to this in some respects. As I mentioned earlier today, there's no question we have a relatively new phenomenon in our national security challenges. It's only in very recent times that we've come to understand the nature of a whole new kind of enemy. It's not just the nation state anymore, which has historically been the nature of military threats, but now there's a very different kind of threat, dispersed, somewhat affiliated, sometimes affiliated, hard to discern, geographically widespread network of terrorists. That's very different than the traditional nation state. That's a different kind of threat, and we've spent a lot of time trying to come to terms with how best to address this. And at an overlapping period of time, a new technology has emerged. We've developed it. It's an amazing technology that gives us the ability from vast distances away to send a very sophisticated unmanned aircraft that is quite lethal and quite capable of destroying a target. And I think most of us probably feel that there are many cases where this is an appropriate tool under appropriate set of circumstances. But frankly, I think it should be the subject of an ongoing discussion. How would we use this? Under what circumstances? Does the president have unlimited unilateral authority or not? And that's a discussion we ought to have about the use of this technology overseas, where I think, as I say, I think it has a very important, very useful, very legitimate function. But when we're talking about using this, the American government using this military asset to kill American citizens on American soil, I'm a little shocked that there isn't an automatic presumption that that's not permissible. Certainly not legal. I can't understand the constitutional basis for those, and I would certainly suggest that the burden ought to be on those who would suggest that that is permissible. And so what the senator from Kentucky has done is said, just tell us the answer to this question. Do you believe that you actually do have this authority? And could you tell us that? You know, if they believe that they have this authority, and since they won't answer unequivocally that they lack the authority, it's hard to infer anything other than that perhaps they think they do have this authority. It obviously raises a whole lot of very, very important questions. Like, under what circumstances would you feel like you have the authority to exercise this power? And exactly whom would be targeted? And how would you decide whom to target? And in the event that you are carrying out a strike using lethal force of this magnitude on American soil against an American citizen, what kind of criteria would govern your judgment about the risks that would be imposed on innocent people who are in the vicinity? And what about any judicial review at all? Would there be any appropriate role for, because of course we have a very long tradition of a due process. You know, there are a lot of Americans who have serious reservations about the idea of indefinite detention on American soil. Indefinite detention is pretty tame compared to being destroyed by a drone. So I would just suggest that the failure of the administration to answer this basic question of whether or not they believe they've got the authority to do something that's completely unprecedented is a very fundamental and important question and completely legitimate. And it is completely appropriate, I think, for this body to insist on an answer to this question before we would go ahead and confirm a person who would have enormous power and authority over a variety of national security issues. So I just want to commend the senator from Kentucky for really putting a bright light on this issue. This is a very important issue, and as I mentioned earlier, he's done it at great personal inconvenience to himself because he has a passionate commitment to the liberty of the American citizens. He manifests that all the time in many ways, and this is one of the ways that he's doing it, and I commend him for that. And I would just conclude my question by addressing the senator, well, through Madam President, my question for the senator is, has there been any change in the status of a lack of response from the administration since the last time we have heard from the administration?
Madam President, we have been asking the question to the White House all day, and we've said all along that we would allow the vote to proceed forward, but we haven't gotten any response from the White House. And the consideration of whether or not we will get a response tonight, I think it's unlikely. We will still keep pressing the issue in the morning as well. But with regard to the senator's remarks, I think one of the things that I hope that will come out of this debate will be that we will reassert our authority as a function of the separation of powers, where our body will say to the president, we not only would like your drone memos on how you think you can do this, but really we should reassert our authority and tell to the president, this is how we think you should do it, and this is the law that's going to dictate and circumscribe how you will do this. That's an authority that I think has been long necessary and we've been letting go by the side, and I think we should reassert. At this time, Madam President, I'd like to yield for
Senator, yield for a question. Would the senator yield for a question?
Without relinquishing the floor, I'll yield for a question.
I thank the senator from Kentucky, and I apologize to my friend from Wisconsin. I know he's been waiting. But the question asked by the senator from Pennsylvania really prompted me to recall a specific set of circumstances which I think address his concerns, our mutual concerns, about the use of lethal force. I know that we're talking about this in the context of drones, but a drone is a weapon. And there are other weapons by which our government can use lethal force to kill people. So I think, going to the question that you asked, Mr. Brennan, in a more generic sense, the question is, when can our government use lethal force in the United States against perhaps U.S. citizens? And I think it's a legitimate question, and I was not misleading the senator earlier when I said there's a scheduled hearing, the only scheduled hearing on this question, coming up before the Judiciary Subcommittee on Constitution, which I chair, and the ranking member, Senator Cruz of Texas, who was here earlier. So I think it's important, and it's an important constitutional question. But I'd just like to say, while the gentleman, my colleague from Pennsylvania, is here, I'd like to recount a set of circumstances for him and then pose a question to you. The circumstances were 9/11/2001. Some of us were in this Capitol building. In fact, just outside this door. And as we came to work, we heard that some plane had crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. As we were watching on television, a few minutes after 9, a second plane crashed into the World Trade Center, the adjoining building. We all know what happened following that. And as we were in our meeting here, just a few feet away, we started seeing black, billowing smoke coming across the mall right outside our window here. A third plane, taken over by these terrorists, was crashing into the Pentagon. What we didn't know at the time was there was a fourth plane. But we evacuated the Capitol, and all of us, literally everyone, raced out of this building to stand on the lawn outside. It wasn't a safe place, but we didn't know where to go. All the tourists, all the staff, and all the rest. It wasn't a few minutes we were out there, and we heard something that sounded like a shot, a discharge of a weapon. In fact, it was fighter planes that were being scrambled to protect the United States Capitol. At that time, the order had gone out to all commercial airplanes in the United States, land immediately, so that we would know who was in our airspace and not responding to that command. It turns out there was one fourth plane involved, and that plane crashed in Pennsylvania, we believe, because of the heroism and bravery of the passengers on board, who, when they realized what was happening, tried to take control of that plane before it could be used as a weapon. Many people believe that plane was aimed for this building or for some place in Washington, D.C. We had scrambled our military planes, and had that plane not crashed into the countryside in Pennsylvania and come within the airspace of this Capitol, I think we know what would have happened. Our government would have used lethal force, military lethal force, to shoot down a civilian airplane that was threatening, we believe, threatening the lives of innocent Americans. It would have been the use of lethal force on our soil to stop a person or persons whom we believed were terrorists about to kill innocent Americans. So when I listened to the response from Attorney General Holder in hypothetical and put it in the context of 9/11, I can imagine that President Bush might have been called on in an instant to make a decision as Commander-in-Chief to bring down the fourth plane before it crashed into another building and killed innocent people. Now that's a circumstance, I'd say to the senator from Pennsylvania and the senator from Kentucky, which I fully understand and expect the Commander-in-Chief to respond to. So I don't think this is such a clear and easy situation. It's important that we have this hearing and explore the many possibilities. The possibility of a terrorist overseas who threatens our safety and the use of lethal force, drones or otherwise. The possibility of a non-U.S. terrorist in the United States and the use of lethal force to deter them.